Together to good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of the Black Mind Garden Live podcast. And, we've been switching it up a little bit over the last couple of weeks. Hi, Dr. Frida. Thank you for joining me live. We've been switching it up over the past couple of weeks. And today, and at the time of this recording or the time of this live, I've done a couple of lives today. So it's a little bit asynchronous. But last week on the podcast, I veered a little bit and talked a little bit more about the understanding, trauma. And, this week I'm coming back to the series that I had started. Now, for those of you who are listening to this on replay on the audio podcast platform, which if you are not on the audio podcast platform listening with us, I invite you to join the Black Mind Garden. It's on Apple, it's on Spotify, Google Play, all of your favorite podcast platforms. So if you're listening to me on one of the video platforms and you want to know how you can take me with you in your car or on your walks, that's how you do it. You go to your podcast platform, look for the Black Mind Garden podcast, and go ahead and come hang out with us when you're out and about, if you're not able to join us live on the live podcast that we do. So if you haven't been following, I have been doing a series on understanding our children's processing through the lens of Myers-Briggs. And, in the beginning, we talked about, hey, you all, thanks for joining us live. In the beginning, we talked about the introvert versus the extrovert, right? And especially dealing with introverted children if you're an extroverted parent, or extroverted children if you're an introverted parent, like myself. And then we went on to talk about how our kids sort of interact or process with the world. So the sensor, who is more of an external, needs to be touching, feeling, and experiencing the world, while the intuitive child is more sort of internal process in their imagination, in their head. And then we went on to talk about the thinker versus the feeler, how our children make decisions, right? The thinker is the more logical, looking at the facts, just the facts. And then the person who is the feeler, the child who's the feeler, is a child who thinks about values, thinks about relationship, and puts a little bit more weight to that than to the facts alone. Not that they don't consider the facts, but that they put a little bit more weight on relationship and personal values and what's important to them. So those up to this point, that's what we've been talking about. And so if you have missed those episodes, you can go to the Black Mind Garden, you can find them, you can listen to them and get yourself caught up. But today, whoa, look at that. Sometimes these mishaps happen in real time. So today, though, what we're talking about is how our kids relate to time and structure. So if we think about, I talked about the very, very, very first, very first conversation that I had, where I sort of overviewed the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, is what we call it. I talked about the 4 letters. So, introvert versus extrovert, sensor, intuitor, thinker, feeler, judger, perceiver. Each of these represents some interaction or some way that our brain processes in relationship to the world. And so this last letter, these last category of letters, is the judger versus the perceiver. And the judger versus the perceiver represents how we relate to time and structure. And so as you begin to think about not just our children, but ourselves it becomes useful to understand the difference between these. And that's, again, another thing, as I've talked through these various categories. And remember, I talk about them on a spectrum. Like, no person is one or the other. There's usually a spectrum in between that we sit on. Maybe there are some people who are on the far end of one side of the spectrum, like the far end of a perceiver, the far end of a judger, which I'm going to talk about what those mean in just a moment. But there could be along a spectrum, everything in between. So it's important as parents, I believe, and to understand our children and how they process, but it's also more useful to do this in relationship to ourselves, because we may be the same or we may be different. We may have different ways. And when we understand how our brain works, we understand how we process things in relationship to time, in relationship to the world, in relationship to making decisions, in relationship to gaining energy, then it helps us to be able to take care of ourselves. And when we understand how others process, it helps us to be able to communicate in a way that helps to reduce the harm that we cause, or that we endure, for that matter. So let's talk a little bit about the perceiver versus the judger. We'll start on the side of the judger. So now the judger side of the spectrum is the side that needs structure, prefers to have structure. So how they interact with time is in a very structured manner, right? So people who test on the side of judging are judgers. So judgers are not like what you might think a person who's like judgmental. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about how they interact with time. So judgers are very structured people, and they're very organized. They like lists. They like Excel sheets. We put things in category, and I do test on the side of judger, right? We put things in category, and to make sense of time, and to make sense and to have the world work for us, we like that structure. Okay. And so on the opposite side of that, and I'm going to come back and distinguish a little bit more both sides. On the opposite end of that spectrum is the perceiver. Now, the perceiver is more spontaneous, right? So they actually resist being tied down to strict protocols and strict structured type of schedules. They resist that. It's not that they can't do it, but our perceivers interact with time in a more free-flowing manner, right? They're more spontaneous. They want to kind of do things on their own time, take their time. So as a consequence, your perceivers are likely to be the people who show up late to a lot of things, because they kind of get lost in time, right? Time is not there's not a huge awareness of time passing, right? They have to have specific things in place. So whereas our judger is very, very aware of time, very connected to the structure of things, and the categorizing of time. Our perceivers are not so much. So this has consequences on both sides. If we let's say we look at ourselves, we can look at our children as well. So you can map this on however you'd like to do so. But our judgers tend to be more rigid when it comes to, especially when it comes to change. So because of that need for structure, and to kind of put it into context, I think what happens with this need for structure, it helps to keep the world a little bit in control for a judger, right? So if the judges kind of have things structured, they know what's going to happen, they feel a little bit more in control, it's a little bit less anxiety provoking. So on the side of a judger. So and as a consequence, what happens is you get someone who's a little bit more rigid and a little bit more resistant to change, a little bit more resistant to things going off schedule. And sometimes what that can look like is, let's say a person's on a regimen, and then life happens and something gets thrown off. a person who's a judger will be very thrown off by that. And one of the things that I talk about in my trainings, my neurolinguistic programming trainings, we talk about, the flexibility of behavior and how flexibility allows for us to be able to handle when the unexpected happens. So a judger who hasn't been trained, who hasn't worked on that type of flexibility will be very thrown off, will even have anxiety when things don't go the way they're supposed to go in the time that they're supposed to go there, right? And so when you with this looks likes in kids is that these type of kids will be very tidy, will have everything organized, will be sort of perfectionists, will be very hard on themselves when they make mistakes, will be a little bit more rigid. Children like this you will notice that they do not like change. And they can deal with change, but if they don't like unexpected change is what I should say, right? One of the things that I notice about my son is that he's very now he honestly, I mean, like transparency, he probably gets it from me. Like this is a learned thing, but he's very structured. We get up in the morning. He has his time that he dedicates to, that he does his little journal in the morning. He has a time that he goes down and makes breakfast. And then after that, he goes and listens to a podcast while mommy's doing yoga or getting ready. And then after that, he gets his stuff together. And then this is like the way he does. So if I surprise him and say we're leaving early, he's like thrown off, right? I remember this is now, but I remember early on when he was young, when he was, even as early as like 2 or 3 years old, and we'd go to the playground. And he'd go, he was 3, 2 or 3, go in the playground. I'd sit and I'd let him play for a certain amount of time. And then I would say, okay, it's time to go. And he would not like it. He would not be done. He would while out. And I would just like wonder, like, why does we do this every time we go to the playground, we play, and then we leave at us after a certain time. And what I realized, and I think I may have read this somewhere, is that it was the unexpected, it's time to go, is the unexpected change that he did not like. Now, I will say that even from a baby, we had a very structured, schedule, like sleeping schedule, eating schedule. So, he kind of got that. And I think he got used to that. What I started doing to remedy that, and this is one of the tips that I can offer, if you have a child that's more on that judger side of the spectrum, is I started giving him the 5-minute warning. Now, of course, at 2 or 3, like children have no concept of time. So 5-minute warning could have been 1 minute, but it was like just to say, hey, 5 more minutes and it's going to be time to go. And so what that did was that in his mind allowed him to process it's going to be time to go soon. And when I started doing that, the tantrums went away. It was done. Like I'd say, okay, 5 more minutes. And then I'd go and I sit back down for, usually 5 more minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, but that was just the word, right? 5 more minutes. And then, a few minutes later, I'd get back up and I say, okay, the 5 minutes is up. It's time to go. And he'd say, okay. And then he'd, come along. Right. So I took that and I mapped it onto a lot of things that throughout, in our activities. So we go to a museum and say, okay, we're going to do this one more thing and then we're going to go. So it gives him the warning. Or like at night when he reads, he loves to read before he goes to bed. So he's reading. I say, okay, it's time to go to bed. Finish up the page that you're reading and let's go. And so in doing that, it allows him what I like to call transition time. Now, of course, there are always going to be times where there's no transition time, and that's life, that's reality, that's the way the world works. But as much as possible, I try to give him that transition time. And I notice for myself, I need that as well. Now, I have been, over the decade or so that I've been doing this work of neurolinguistic programming, I've learned to be more flexible on my feet with abrupt change and to be able to think of what there is that I need to do next. But in my natural environment, I love to have lead time is what I like to call it, right? Lead time. So that's the judger side of things, right? Now, then you have the perceiver. Now, okay, so I talked about the judger as the child, but then there's the judger as the parent. And what we can begin to do is to do some of those similar things, give ourselves lead time, give ourselves decompress time, and begin to work on the flexibility, having some flexibility around our schedule. And so I'm gonna pop over to the perceiver side now. So the perceiver people, children, adults too, the perceiver people are the people who get lost in time, right? So kids doing something and playing along, playing along, playing along. Next thing you know, it's how many hours later. And as an adult, that also can happen as well. If there's very little structure that's ever imposed, it could be that there's this sort of spontaneity that gets cultivated. Now, let me just pause and say, neither side is better than the other. Both sides are useful at certain times in certain contexts, right? So on the weekend, you want to be able to be spontaneous and kind of like free flowing and whatnot. If you're rigid during the weekend, how can you relax and enjoy yourself? Now, that's not to say you can't, but it's like, if you're always have a space of rigidity, then it can make it very difficult to enjoy some of the things that come with spontaneity. But then with people who are like so on the perceiver side and so resistant to structure that it impedes upon their ability to organize themselves to actually, take the actions that they want to take. So that is a consequence of being far on the perceiver side, right? So the perceiver is very flowy, very often, can be a little bit more disorganized as a consequence, can be late a lot as a consequence. So what do you do if you start to notice as yourself and or as your child that's far on that perceiver side? Well, one of the things that, and I know in some aspects of my life, I am on the perceiver side. I'm on the judger side in some contexts, and I'm on the perceiver side in others. So what I do is I set alarms. Alarms are one of my best friends. And when I set alarms for myself, it alerts me to that it's time to transition to the next thing. So that the alarms are sort of like, of course, that's part of my judger structure stuff. And I know that if I don't set them, I might get lost in time. So that's in certain contexts, like when I'm writing or when I'm like really in my creative self, then that's when I can get lost in time. And by the way, perceivers tend to be like artists, tend to be very creatives. And so that's why they tend to get lost in time. They get into their creative process and then boom, time is gone. So, putting in structure helps the perceiver. And while there may be some resistance to it, putting in the structure will help a perceiver child and even a perceiver adult be much more productive and effective. Now, here's a way to put in structure for a perceiver that feels a little bit less restrictive or constraining. You put structure in ranges, right? So, people who are perceivers don't typically like calendars. And if you calendarize ranges of time, that sometimes can help there be some freedom, some structure, but some freedom inside of the structure, right? And so, for example, if something needs to be done by a certain time, when you set a deadline of by a certain time, rather than saying at a certain time, then that little tweak in language could help a perceiver not feel as constrained, right? Whereas, like for me, as I was writing my book, I just finished writing a book. You'll probably hear about that, in the coming months. But as I was writing the book, I had a very specific block of time that I use from you know, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. what on any given day, on Monday through Friday, were my time blocks. And so I could sit down anytime between 2 and 3 and write out a chapter or a part of a chapter, right? And so having done that, I could either use the entire hour or I can use part of the hour. And that gave me structure, and it also gives me freedom inside of the structure. So that's one way that you can flex for a perceiver, that gives them structure, but also can give them a little bit of flex inside of that structure. So they know they have a deadline that they need to get things done, and yet they have a little flexibility inside of that. Now, one of the benefits of perceiver people, and particularly children, are very adaptable to change. So if things like shift up or change up, then they're able to adapt to that and go with the flow. But it's that really organization piece that they can sometimes struggle with. So perceiver children need more accountability when it comes to completing things in a specific amount of time than judger children. If you say to a judger child, I need this done by this time, they will set up the structure to make sure that it's done. They will break it down into its elements. They will break it down into its elements so that it would get done in the time that it needs to get done. They'll do it, and they'll do it most times unprompted. When I was in college, I one of the things I used to hate was term papers. Oh, really hated term papers. But and they were overwhelming to me. And so what I would do is when I would get we would get all the assignments for term papers, and I would plot out, when it was due, work backwards, and write a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. So I always had my paper written on time. And then I would have these friends or these roommates who would wait until like the night before, and they would like do the entire paper, stay up all night. And I never understood how people could do that, right? That's my structure. That's my judger. So the judger you give them something to do. They'll work out the organization. And sometimes they may need a little help, but they'll work that out, right? Perceiver children need a little bit more hand holding where that's concerned. It's, well, how is it that you are going to structure that? What can we do to put what structures can we put in place? We can do it at this time, this time, this time. So our perceiver children may need a little bit more in terms of structure with chores, with homework, with things of that nature, moving from one thing to the next. And that's one of the things to keep in mind as a parent. As like my son, like he needs no managing. He gets up in the morning and he does what he's supposed to do. And I don't have to worry about it because he just knows what to do. He doesn't have a lot of trouble transitioning from one thing to the next. So that's just an overview of these two dichotomies, these two polarities in personality of the Myers-Briggs, and how, when we understand not only our children's, but our own relationship to time, and then we can begin to be compassionate about our children and know kind of what to do and how to interact with them. And then if you're a judge or parent with a perceiver child, then you can help them to become more structured by putting in some of these, by hand holding them. We can't expect that our kids are going to automatically think and do things the way we do them, right? So, and if we are a perceiver, a parent who has a child who wants more structure, who's very structured, who needs that structure, then it will take some learning to bring us a little bit over to the structured side, right? So, this brings me to a point of how our children can actually be our teachers and accountability buddies, even when they're not trying to. Because if we're learning to empower them, we have to step up as parents to learn the skills and the tools and to become more flexible to be able to support them in the way and that they need to support it, to move through these developmental stages with a little bit more ease. And that's why I do the work that I do. That's why I teach neurolinguistic programming. And by the way, in an upcoming episode, I'm going to really break down. People always ask, how does this help? How does this help? What is neurolinguistic programming? And every now and then I like to break it down so people can understand like what this is and what is the reason I talk about it so much. Not just because I teach it, not just because I practice it, but because it is a set of tools, a way of being, a set of language that is just so essential to really improving our flexibility, expanding our emotional fluency, our thinking fluency, our communication fluency. It is just essential. So if you're wondering more about that, stay tuned, listen more. Pass this episode on to someone who you think would enjoy it. Leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. That's how we, let other people know who come behind us that this is a valuable information that we're giving. And if you want to know more about the podcast, the program itself, the neurolinguistic programming, you can go to mindremappingacademy.com. If you're listening on any of the other platforms, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, you'll see the website right there. If you're with me on Instagram, you can click the link in my bio. So looking forward to the next time I'll be breaking down some other concepts with you. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk about neurolinguistic programming, but next week, we're going to talk about how we as parents meet challenging behavior with our kids. So y'all have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And I will see you on the next one. Thanks for joining me live. For those of you who are here, bye.